Okay, guys, welcome back to the third key knowledge dot point of this first outcome of Unit 2. And today we're looking at choosing suppliers. So here's our study design for the outcome. And there you can see in the yellow, the key knowledge dot point we're going to be talking about today. Okay, so first off, suppliers. It's not a completely new concept. We've talked about this in a few other key knowledge dot points during Unit 1. For example, 1.3.1, when we're looking at the internal environment, we looked at, if you remember, business resource needs and the factors affecting their choice, natural labour and capital resources. So if you remember that stuff, well, now what we're talking about here is where do these resources actually come from, okay? So suppliers, basically. So to define supplier, a person or organisation, basically usually a business, that provides something that you need to run your own business, some kind of product, some kind of service, some kind of piece of equipment. So basically, when you're running a business, you need lots of stuff to run it. Suppliers are where you get this stuff from. Simple as that. Now, when we are establishing our business, when we're setting up our business, it's important that we choose the best suppliers that are going to suit the needs of our business. So what you need to do is think about how your product or service sits within the market and choose suppliers that kind of reflect that. And as we go through this, you'll sort of see how that plays out. Basically, suppliers are going to provide the inputs. Inputs is another word for resources, basically. It's a word we'll use a bit more in Year 12. Suppliers supply the inputs or the resources from which you are going to create your outputs. And the output is basically the product or the service that you are going to be selling to your customers. So a business is basically about taking a whole bunch of inputs, putting them through some kind of transformation process to create an output that you will then sell. So basically, what we're saying with all of this stuff is that it's really important to choose inputs that are going to allow you to create the outputs that you are trying to create. So how complex can this be? The answer is pretty complex. So look, I'm just going to start with an example. This is just a random restaurant back in England that I know pretty well, down in Devon. And this is just a really quite a small restaurant, probably 40 or 50 covers, not a big place at all. You would think a fairly simple operation. The reason I've chosen this one is because on their website, they actually have a list of all their suppliers. It's pretty unusual for a business to do that, at least a small restaurant, but they do. So this is just to demonstrate to you how complex this can be. So basically, as we go through these next few pages, you'll see, total produce. So they're getting fruit and vegetables, locally sourced range of fruit and vegetables. S&J fisheries, they're getting fresh fish and shellfish. So Celtic fish and game, getting some more fish from there and some game and some dry goods. And then so on and so forth. As we go through all of these different suppliers, and bear in mind, this is just one small restaurant. There's a lot of different suppliers that they use. And then we get on to where they're getting their drinks from. Riedel, crystal glassware. Of course, if you're in a restaurant, you need glassware. Tableware, come from Villeroy Bosch. It's a pretty complex process, even for a seemingly small, fairly straightforward business. If we take this to a larger scale now, H&M. Okay, I would imagine most of you are familiar with H&M, Swedish multinational clothing retail company, fast fashion clothing, men, women, teenagers, children. There's some stats around it, 62 countries, 5,000 stores, 130,000 employees, so on and so forth. That's from a couple of years ago, but I don't think it would have changed too much since then. Now, they are supplied by businesses from all of these different countries, okay? There's 38 of them. So again, this is a huge international, multinational company. So you would expect it maybe to be a bit more complex, but 38 different countries, they are sourcing their clothing that they sell from. So breaking that down a little further, they have 76 different suppliers in India. And between those 76 suppliers in India, they operate 431 different factories. And then 40 different suppliers in Indonesia operating 145 factories, and so on and so forth. China, you can see, is a pretty huge one, as you might expect these days. So 285 different suppliers there, operating almost 1,000 factories amongst those 285 suppliers. All up, H&M, 900 suppliers in 38 countries operating 3,300 factories. So hugely complex operation, getting all of the clothes, into all those different stores that they have around the world. Let's bring this home to an Australian business. Kmart, Australia, New Zealand. They get their supplies from 756 different factories. And from those different countries, maybe 8, 9, 10, I'm not sure how many countries there. And again, mainly Asia, again, probably to be expected. I don't think that's a new concept to you. Coles, they stock in their stores around 25,000 different products, and they are sourced from over 5,000 different suppliers. And Woolies would be similar to that, if you wanted to look at that business. Now, let's just come back to the study design. Okay, let's get back to what the study design says we need to kind of know. So all that stuff was just kind of putting into some context for you. So the study design said that you see there. Now we're going to break that down into two kind of component parts and treat them as like a part one, part two. So first off, the importance of choosing appropriate suppliers, and then we're going to look at the corporate social responsibility angle. So when we talk about the importance of choosing appropriate suppliers, basically what we're talking about here is appropriate suppliers in respect of the price that you're going to pay, the quality that you're going to get, the reliability of those suppliers, and the location of them. So that's what we're going to look at now, breaking that importance of choosing appropriate suppliers into those kind of different areas, if you like. So first off, price. Lots of different questions, and this is not an exhaustive complete list, but this is an example of the kinds of questions that you need to be thinking when you are thinking about the price that you want to pay for your supplies. How much you're willing to pay for your resources, for your supplies. How much are those suppliers charging? And bear in mind, there's usually going to be, not multiple options. There's usually not just one place that you could get a certain type of supply. You have options, and that's why there's this choice involved. If you pay less for supplies, are you getting a lower quality resource? Do you need low or high quality resources to produce the output, in other words, that product or service again, that you need? Are you targeting a high-end market or cost-conscious consumers? Can you negotiate lower prices with some suppliers in return for larger orders? This concept of bulk buying, kind of how the world works. The more of something you buy from someone, usually, the lower the price per item that you're going to pay. So that should make some sense. Really what we're talking about here is, the level of price that you're paying needs to reflect the quality of the output that you are trying to produce. So now we go into quality, and this kind of links really closely to price because I've just mentioned quality a few times. So the quality of the resources that you use in your business is obviously going to influence the quality of the final product service. If we go back to the idea of a restaurant, if you're using higher quality ingredients, you're going to produce higher quality dishes, okay? Something like McDonald's doesn't need super high quality ingredients. It does need consistent ingredients, but it doesn't need the level of quality that a high-end restaurant charging, maybe a couple of $100 per head for a dinner, for example. You've got to think, can you charge a higher price to cover the cost of higher quality inputs? Again, it's all a balance. And if you use lower quality inputs, are you going to increase the level of waste that you're producing in your business? And there's cost and social responsibility implications there. If you're throwing stuff away because the quality is poor, then there's obviously a cost to throwing stuff away. And of course, social responsibility, the implications of, throwing stuff away, not good for the environment, not good for society, so on and so forth. So what we're trying to do in a business is constantly trying to minimize the amount of waste that we're producing as well. Reliability. How reliable are those suppliers? Are they going to make delivery errors, or are they going to deliver late? If you've got an order time window, are they going to deliver in that window that you need the stuff? Because if they don't, there's an implications on your ability to produce the product or service that you are trying to sell. Again, with a restaurant, if you didn't get your meat delivery on one given day, meat dishes might be off the menu, and that's not a good look. So there's those implications on customer satisfaction. If people come to your business, they expect to be able to buy the products and service that you usually offer. And if you've not had supplies arrive, which means you can't produce or sell your product or service, not a good look, and you might end up losing customers to competitors. Location. Look, we looked at business location again earlier in the course. So here you've got to think about, do you want to just use suppliers that are close to your business? There's lower transport costs associated with that. The social responsibility issue around reducing the carbon footprint if you're bringing the suppliers from less distance away. Or are you going to look further afield for your supplies, which might give you access to potentially cheaper resources? But then there's other negatives. For example, if you're talking about further away in terms of a different country, you might have time zone issues, which makes communication difficult. There might be language barriers and all that sort of stuff. So again, you've got to balance up all of these things and work out across all of these 4 categories we just look at, what's important to you, and make your decisions on where you're getting your supplies based on all of this stuff. Okay, so a lot of thinking to be done, a lot of research to be done to kind of come up with your final list of suppliers for all of the resources that you need in your business. Now, coming back to the study design, that was all the first part of the key knowledge dot point. Now moving on to this second part, the benefits and limitations of suppliers which meet the corporate social responsibility objectives of the business. And now we focus on that part of the key knowledge dot point. So what we're saying here is you also need to consider the CSR of your suppliers. So as a business operator, you need to think about your own social responsibility. And again, this is not a new concept. We've been talking about this a bit, throughout various parts of the course so far. So you're familiar with the concept of social responsibility. So when you're operating a business, you want to operate in a socially responsible way yourself. But what we're saying is here, you also want to think about the social responsibility of the suppliers that you're going to be using. So how sustainably do they operate? Sustainably, I've given you a couple of definitions down there. Look, if there's so many different ways to define the concept of sustainability, I think your generation have grown up in a world where sustainability in general is kind of a real thing. So you've kind of grown up with an awareness of this, probably more so than my generation. So look, there's just 2 different ways that you could define that concept. How well do your suppliers treat their employees? Again, that's part of social responsibility. And how well do your suppliers treat the local environment and the community in which they operate? Okay, this is important because when you deal with suppliers, if they operate with some negative CSR, it can kind of brush up on your business as well. So like you can kind of get tarred with the same brush because your business might be associated with that. So it's important that your suppliers operate with a similar level of social responsibility that you yourself want to be associated. Just a couple of examples, okay? So ethical treatment of employees. So suppliers that provide employees with sufficient pay and decent working conditions. Look, in Australia, if you're dealing with Australian suppliers, we have a lot of law around how businesses can treat their employees. We have minimum wage legislation across every industry. So it's not necessarily about, in fact, it's not at all about just meeting legal requirements. It's kind of a social responsibility. Remember, part of the definition of social responsibility is about going above and beyond just meeting legal obligations. If you're meeting legal obligations, you're paying minimum wage. That's not being socially responsible. That's just meeting legal requirements. Being socially responsible is kind of going above and beyond. Ethical treatment of employees, and I'll give you some examples in a minute, is probably more to do with if you're dealing with suppliers in other countries that don't necessarily have the same legal protections around their workers, their employees that are working in businesses. And again, in a minute, I'll give you an example. Your suppliers, do they ethically source their materials? So do you need suppliers that source their inputs in an ethical and a sustainable way? And do your suppliers use environmentally friendly processes within their businesses? So do they do things like recycling, waste minimization, and reducing their carbon footprint? Okay, so just a few examples of more specific about how businesses, and in this case, your suppliers, can demonstrate that they are being socially responsible. Now, the advantages, because the key knowledge dot point, remember, talked about the advantages and disadvantages, or I think is it benefits and limitations. So the advantages of doing this, of using suppliers with high levels of CSR, improve reputation for your business, and therefore increased competitiveness in the market, because people, especially these days, want to be buying from businesses that do operate in a sustainable and ethical and a socially responsible way. An employee and attraction and retention tool. Okay, so what we're saying is here, if your business demonstrates social responsibility, and like I say, by extension, that means you deal with suppliers that also demonstrate the same level of social responsibility, it means you can attract the best employees in the market. People want to work for ethical, socially responsible businesses. So you can have your pick of the employees, particularly if some of your competitors are deemed by society to not be operating in that way. That's the employee attraction, and employee retention just means keeping good workers. So once you've got those workers on board, rather than leaving your business and moving on to maybe competitors or other businesses, it's about retaining good workers. And again, later on in the course and also in year 12, we look in a lot more detail about other ways in which we can do this and the importance of attracting and retaining the best employees that you possibly can. And all of that combined leads to more profit for your business. Disadvantages of doing this. Look, the list of disadvantages is not great, not very long. Basically, look, it might reduce your choice in suppliers, because if you think about it, you've got a range of suppliers you can choose from. Say you've got 10 suppliers, there might be only 2 or 3 of them that do actually operate with the level of social responsibility that you would consider dealing with. So therefore, obviously, it reduces your choice in where you get your supplies from. And also potentially higher cost of those inputs. You'll often find that resources that have been produced in this sort of sustainable, ethical way can cost more than those that haven't. So again, then we come back to this idea of quality, price, and that kind of equation, and getting that balance right. So therefore, you could argue less profit. If you're paying more for your resources, you could say, well, there's less profit. And when we looked at the advantages just previously, we said it leads to more profit. So again, it's a balancing act. You do a cost benefit analysis. Cost benefit analysis, you look at a situation, you look at how much it's going to cost you, and then you work out, the potential gains or benefits from making that decision. And if the costs outweigh the benefits, then you might not make that decision. But if the benefits outweigh the costs, then you'd go ahead with that decision, choosing that particular supplier, for example. Now, I'll just give you a couple of examples here just to put some of this again into context. Abuse is daily reality for female garment workers for Gap and H&M. Look, so basically, here's a little bit more detail in here you can read through. But look, the rag trade, the garment industry, the clothing industry, for many years has kind of been tarnished with this brush of using suppliers, particularly in parts of Asia, that really do not demonstrate social responsibility in many, many ways. And here we're talking about how they treat their workers. Look, over the last decade or so, a lot of these Western multinational clothing businesses, it mentions Gap in here, and again back to H&M, there's been a real focus on them cleaning up their act in terms of making sure they're only dealing with suppliers that do not do this kind of stuff. So there is a real focus on these businesses in kind of having a better look, if you like. Here's a very specific example. 2013, there was this huge clothing factory in Bangladesh, which was producing clothes for most of the major Western brands and some very, very expensive high-end brands as well. And the factory basically collapsed, killing can see over 1,100 people, injuring a couple thousand more. Only a couple of months before, there was another factory nearby where a bunch of people had lost their lives. And in fact, this factory, when they kind of investigated afterwards, they found out that the owners of the factory knew that there were structural faults with the factory, but it was going to cost a lot to repair that. So rather than doing that, they just kind of took a punt on everything being okay. And as it turned out, it wasn't, and all of these people lost their lives. So at that time, this did come back. This was a really bad look for a lot of those Western brands that were using this factory as a supplier. The iPhone, again, obviously a product you're familiar with. This may be a story you're aware of, maybe not. This is actually an excerpt from a press piece from about 10, 12 years ago, or 2010. Basically what was happening. So basically one of iPhone, or one of Apple's major suppliers for the iPhone, is a company called Foxconn. Now, actually, the reality is Foxconn actually produce mobile phones and mobile phone parts for many other brands, including Samsung. But when this all kind of broke, I guess because Apple is kind of at the top of the tree, and the media likes to knock a hero, Apple there was a lot of fallout where realistically a lot of other brands should probably also have copped a similar kind of fallout from this, but the focus was kind of more on Apple. Basically what happened was the conditions in the Foxconn factories were appalling, and in 2010 the workers in those factories started throwing themselves out of the windows higher up, committing suicide basically. So there was this spate of suicides. And you can see there in the pictures, basically the solution was, rather than to deal with the conditions that workers were working under, they just installed suicide nets around the bottom of the buildings to catch the people, to stop them killing themselves, rather than dealing with the root cause, the source of the problem. So that was deemed to be really, really not a socially responsible way to behave. And like I say, there was a lot of fallout at the time that kind of came back to Apple, even though it wasn't an Apple business. Again, this is why we're talking about this here. Foxconn was a supplier to Apple, but because it's such an integral part of the Apple business, the fallout came back to Apple as well. And that is it for choosing suppliers, guys. I will see you in the next video for Key Knowledge 4. Cheers for now.